Hello, my name is Caleb Lopez and I'm Chief Investment Officer at University Wealth Advisors. Today we're going to be discussing more frequently asked questions that I get as an investment advisor. In today's episode, the first frequently asked question we're going to discuss is one that is coming up a lot with most of the clients that I'm talking with right now. That question is, what do we do if the market takes a downturn or we enter into a recession? Last episode, I had mentioned that I hate getting the question, what's your take on the market? Because it's so difficult to know what's going to happen in the markets at any given point. I wanted to clarify and reiterate that just because we don't know what's going to happen in the markets in the future doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do when it comes to protecting money or making strategic decisions about your asset allocation. For example, right now, many clients are concerned about Trump tariffs. As of February 1st, our president has announced that there are going to be tariffs on multiple different countries and on multiple different imports. The reason this is affecting the stock market is because tariffs are essentially a tax that is paid by the individuals who are exporting goods here to the United States. Businesses typically don't eat those costs. They reformulate their pricing to pass those costs on to consumers. What this means is that tariffs are inherently inflationary, and consumers and traders are concerned that with tariffs are going to come higher prices and a weaker economic forecast. Because of this, many investors are flooding to safe assets like cash and bonds to protect themselves from a market downturn. While that's not a bad idea, the issue is that we never know how much further the market has to drop and whether or not we're at a bottom in the equity markets. Our view is that a long-term strategic approach to asset allocation can help protect you in times of economic distress. For example, we would want to make sure that each one of our clients, if they're close to retirement, have enough in safe assets like cash and bonds of various durations in order to get them through any downturn in the markets until the equity market recovers. An example of this would be all of my clients who are about to retire. I need to make sure that they have enough in safe assets already so that when something like this happens, we're not stuck trying to sell out of stocks at an inopportune moment. So my question to you would be, how far out are you from retiring? And are you confident that the strategy you already have is the optimal strategy for your retirement plan? And would speaking with a fiduciary independent advisor help you gain the confidence, clarity, and the strategy you need in order to make it through a time like this? While many people think that it is a bad time to start investing when the economy is down, depending on when your retirement date is, now could actually be a really, really good time to start investing in the markets if you haven't done so already. Or you can keep investing in markets if you have adequate time until you reach retirement. For example, my wife and I are in the process of purchasing a home. If you came to me and said, don't buy that home now because 6 months from now, it's going to be 10% cheaper, I would be very thankful for that advice. I would say I would love to purchase this home for 10% cheaper than it is today. However, when it comes to the markets, the stock market, the equity market, bond markets, we often have trouble thinking in those terms. But one way that I like to reframe market corrections, especially to clients who have time until retirement, is that right now stocks are on sale, meaning you can purchase into the economy for, in this case, 9 to 10% cheaper than you could around February of this year. So for starters, let's say that you're somebody who is nowhere near retirement. How should you handle a market correction? Now is a great time to add money to your accounts as opposed to taking money away from them. Now the conversation becomes slightly different if you are already retired. If you're already retired, the way we manage a market downturn is going to be a lot different than the way we manage a market downturn when you're still working. Now things become trickier as you get, let's say, 5 years out until you retire. If you're 5 years away from retirement, your portfolio management is going to have to be very, very strategic, especially if there's talk about a recession happening somewhere in the next 3 to 4 years. The reason being is because of a risk called sequence of returns risk. Sequence of returns risk is a risk that an investor can average the same rate of return. However, the sequence in which those returns come to them, being negative in the early years of their retirement or right before retirement, will disproportionately affect them later on down the road. The reason being is because when you retire, you're not adding money to your portfolio anymore. You're taking money away from your portfolio. So big losses early in retirement are disproportionately negative than big losses later in retirement. Conventional wisdom would tell you that you should take less risk as you age. However, that's not quite true. Modern research suggests that you should take less risk closer to when you transition into retirement in order to avoid sequence of returns risk. So with sequence of returns risk, a great chart is the one that I'm showing here, which shows two investors that have the same average rate of return. But what you can see is that the sequence in which those rates of return annualized or credited to them is opposite. So for example, investor blue starts with a positive 9% rate of return, then gets 11%, then gets 18%, then gets 14%. And investor green starts with negatives. He starts with -5, -6, -15. And even though by the end of retirement, all of those numbers actually end up averaging the same annualized rate of return, investor blue ends 15 years later with $105,944, while investor green only has $35,889. This is a perfect example of why, if you are close to retirement, you should be talking about this with your advisor, and if not, making a strategic plan so that you can avoid this negative outcome that comes with sequence of returns risk. Now, finally, the way you handle a market downturn is going to be different if you're already retired than if you're in those first two categories, not near retirement or close to retirement. If you are already retired, there are many things that we can do in order to get you through a recession comfortably and keeping your retirement and financial plan on track. A lot of times, headlines actually look worse than the reality of how the headlines affect your portfolio. An example of this is with a lot of clients that I'm talking with right now, many of them have actually not lost any money this year. They're flat at a 0% rate of return. The reason being is because they have diversified their assets, where even though US equity is currently down due to Trump tariffs, international equity has performed well. So if you have proper diversification and asset allocation, you can diversify away a lot of risks inherent in investing in the markets. It doesn't mean all risk goes away, but it means we can manage it much more effectively. To bring it back to the point, if you're already retired, there are multiple things you can do in order to make sure that your retirement plan stays on track. One of which is, instead of taking an inflation-adjusted income every single year, you can delay your inflation adjustment until the markets recover. So what that usually looks like in practice is most advisors, if they're good advisors, build in about a 2.5% inflation adjustment for their retired clients each year. What that means is if you live on 100 grand a year, you're gonna get a 2.5% bump each year so that your income keeps up with inflation. But if the market goes down, instead of making any really dramatic moves, what you could consider doing is living on 2.5% less in that year and just not taking your inflation adjustment. And usually small tweaks like that are actually going to be enough to get your retirement plan back on track. So the first frequently asked question is, what are we going to do if the market takes a downturn? It's something we're seeing now, but as you can see, the answer is very complicated and it's very dependent on where you're at in your financial journey. Moving away from a very technical conversation about market downturns, asset allocations, we're going to look at some other frequently asked questions that we get that are more broad in nature. What is the minimum investment required to work with you? Our firm has a minimum of $100,000 in investable assets, which most people, if they've been saving for retirement or if they're close to retirement, have accumulated more than that. The other thing that we do is we implement relationship-based pricing, which means that the more investment dollars you bring to our firm, the lower by percentage your fee goes. The reason for this is because even if we have a lower percentage on a larger dollar amount, oftentimes the dollar fee tends to be higher. So we like to give our larger relationships a discount to incentivize them to bring more money to our firm. Now, that doesn't mean that we will refuse to work with anybody if they're referred to us or if there's somebody who genuinely needs help. It's just that there is a economic reality to running a wealth management business that means we have to have enough in investable assets to cover an advisor's time and the technology that goes into serving clients the way that we do. Another frequently asked question, one that I think can be very interesting depending on how you take it, is how can I and should I involve my spouse or other family members in the planning process? I always recommend that the more people you have involved in the process, the easier it becomes, especially if that's with a spouse, a child, or maybe even your parents. Many times I work with clients whose parents pass away and leave them sizable estates that my clients then inherit and invest with me. Oftentimes what I see though is if a parent has not done proper estate planning, the outcome that my client or their children in general receive is very different than what could have been. An example of this is a lot of times people will purchase estate planning documents and they won't actually fill them out properly or connect any of their assets to that estate plan. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give an estate planning recommendation, but when it comes to involving family in the financial planning process, I always recommend the more open communication you can have with your loved ones always paves the way for a better outcome down the road. This could be your financial advisor having a conversation with your parents and you about distributions to the next generation. It could be a conversation with you and your children about how you want the wealth you've worked for to be used. Those conversations about legacy and legacy planning are one of the things that differentiate a true financial planner and a true financial plan that's holistic from simply investment advice or simply investing money in the markets. In fact, this is an interesting anecdote. My firm doesn't do this, but in ultra high net worth family offices, there are often a number of professionals on staff that are solely there in order to work with and work through family dynamics and dysfunctions. So for example, in a lot of high net worth individual businesses and families, there are various family dynamics at play. One sibling feels that they never got the opportunities they deserved in the family business. One person always feels that the other person was favored. There's all these family dynamics that go into the finances of these families. And what I learned recently, which is very interesting, is that some large family office investment firms will staff counselors, like mental health or family dynamic counselors, to talk with those wealthy families about how to distribute wealth throughout those generations. Now, we don't quite go to that extent when we're talking with families. However, I think that that is an interesting idea to have in mind when you're talking with your advisor and with your family about your legacy and your legacy planning. What software do clients get access to when they work with you? Clients who work with our firm get access to two key pieces of technology. The first is a client portal. The client portal covers everything from performance reporting, data tracking, and a timeline of the conversations we've had while working together. They also get access to financial planning software. The financial planning software is where we forecast clients' probability of success and also allow for budgeting insights. The combination of these two software programs offer a very powerful and unique insight to our clients' finances, and they allow us to keep track of everything that we're doing along the way. Another frequently asked question is, how do I save money for my children? When saving money for children, the key is to identify what the purpose of the savings is. Are you saving money for education, or are you saving money for general wealth creation? If you're saving money for education, almost always the best use of your money is in one of the state 529 plans. The reason being is because in 2024, the Secure Act 2.0 made some key changes to 529s, which make them very favorable to families who want to save for their children's college education. There was always a concern if you saved money in a 529 for your children's college that they would either not go to college, or even if they did, they wouldn't spend all the money that you had saved in the account. In order to incentivize families to save money for their children's college education, the Secure Act 2.0 came out with a rule that you can convert any unused funds in a 529 into a Roth IRA for the beneficiary if they meet all the qualifications. This basically ensures that while you get to save money for your children's college, if they either don't go to college or don't spend all the money, they still get to benefit from the money you've saved, and you're not disproportionately affected negatively by not using all those funds. The other option would be to set up a UTMA, which is an account which is owned by a minor, but has kind of a trustee, which usually is the parent or guardian. The reason most people or most advisors would recommend the 529 over the UTMA is because the 529 is tax advantaged, where all proceeds, if used for qualified education expenses, are tax-free. That is not the case with the individual account custodied for the minor. Most people would want to use the funds for education and for retirement savings for their children anyway. So in that case, we find that the 529 usually is the clear winner.